My name is Elias Vance. I am 34 years old, and I restore archival documents for a living. I spend my days stabilizing torn ledgers, lifting water damage from century-old survey maps, and preserving records that families try to forget. Ink fades. Paper tears. But the truth, if you handle it carefully, always survives. I learned that from my grandfather, Arthur. I also learned it the night he sat on his front porch in a March thunderstorm with 2 canvas bags at his feet. My phone buzzed at 8:14 p.m. A neighbor I barely knew, Arthur's on the porch. Rain sideways. He won't come inside. I was 40 minutes away. I drove it in 30. The wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. The kind that soaks through wool and settles into your bones. I didn't call my parents. I already knew what they'd say. I already knew why he was out there. 4 months earlier, Arthur had sold his historic surveying estate. The closing brought in $900,000. He didn't place it in a trust. He didn't retain a care manager. He wired every cent to my parents' joint account on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at their kitchen table when he authorized it. My father kept repeating, "Dad, you don't have to do this." Arthur just looked at him across the oak table, hands resting over his silver pocket watch, and said it plain, "Keep your word to me." That was the entire arrangement. A wire transfer and 3 words. My mother nodded like she'd finally balanced a ledger. I should have known then what a cleared check means to people who measure loyalty in transactions. But I was busy preserving other people's histories, ignoring the one crumbling in my own family. By the time I pulled into their driveway that night, the porch light was off. The house was dark. They'd put him out and gone to bed. I killed the engine, listened to the rain hammer the roof, and stepped into the storm. I wasn't going to ask for an explanation. I was just going to bring him home. Arthur Vance wasn't just a landowner, he was a surveyor who spent 50 years mapping boundaries that held communities together. When the development offer came for the estate, he didn't haggle. He signed. $900,000 cleared into my parents' account by Friday. I expected a conversation about care facilities, home modifications, or a structured support plan. Instead, I got silence. To Richard and Eleanor, that wire transfer wasn't a safeguard. It was a settlement. A buyout. In their ledger, the transaction was complete. The debt of filial duty, they believed, had been paid in full. They didn't move him into a proper guest room. They moved him into the converted storage space at the back of their house. The door stayed closed. The phone calls to me grew vague. "We're managing everything properly, Elias," my mother would say, her tone polished with practiced concern. "He gets confused. We just need to handle the logistics." I learned later that handling logistics meant controlling access, filtering his mail, and ensuring the responsible relative stayed in the dark. Then came the March storm. The canvas bags on the porch. The porch light flickering out behind us. They hadn't just neglected him, they'd archived him. Filed him away until he became inconvenient. I didn't argue. I didn't demand an apology. I just opened my truck door and helped him step down from the wet concrete. My apartment was 800 square feet of drafting tables, acid-free storage boxes, and quiet. It wasn't built for 2, but it was built for precision. I gave him the bedroom. I took the floor beside my work desk. By morning, I had replaced panic with process. I built a care matrix, medication intervals tracked to the minute, blood pressure logs cross-referenced with dietary restrictions, cardiology appointments color-coded on a wall calendar. I treated his recovery like a fragile manuscript. Stabilize the environment. Control the variables. Preserve what remains. He watched me work from the bed, his hands resting over that silver pocket watch he never took off. On his third night, he pulled a worn leather field journal from his bag and set it on the nightstand. "You measure everything now," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Good. People forget that time is just another boundary. You have to respect it." I nodded, adjusting his pillow. He didn't thank me. He didn't need to. The promise wasn't in the words. It was in the work. And as the rain slowed to a drip outside my window, I finally understood what my parents had missed. A cleared check doesn't keep a promise. Only patience does. I rebuilt my archival restoration practice the way Arthur handled a survey, one precise line at a time. Before he moved in, I was taking whatever contract work I could find, patching water damage for corporate clients who cared only about speed. With him at my kitchen table, I started applying his methods. He taught me to read the grain of the paper before I touched the ink. "Don't force the tear," he'd say, tapping his brass compass against a faded boundary map. "Find the original line. It's always there if you know how to look." I stopped rushing jobs. I started charging for accuracy. Within 2 months, I had a waiting list. Municipal archives, private collectors, even historical societies reached out. I was stabilizing other people's histories while quietly preserving his. The clues didn't arrive all at once. They surfaced like ink rising through damp paper. First, the compass. It lived on his nightstand, heavy brass, glass face slightly scratched. I noticed it never pointed to magnetic north. It pointed true north, calibrated to a specific coordinate. I checked it against a 1972 county survey I was restoring. The needle aligned perfectly with an old conservation easement marker. Then the journal. I'd assumed it was just sketches and weather notes. But as I cross-referenced his blocky handwriting with municipal records, the patterns emerged. Every entry matched a parcel deed, a water table reading, a dormant conservation lease. He hadn't just been surveying land. He'd been cataloging a legacy. On the 4th month, I found the envelope. Cream stock, embossed corner, Margaret Thorne, attorney at law. Estate trust. It was tucked between 2 leather-bound folios, unopened. I didn't tear it. I didn't even slide a blade under the flap. Some documents are meant to be presented, not intercepted. I placed it back exactly where I found it. That evening, Julian called. My brother's voice carried that familiar edge of calculated urgency. "Elias, we need to talk about Dad's affairs. Mom's worried. I think someone should hold power of attorney. Keep it in the family. Protect the assets." I looked at the compass. I looked at the journal. I looked at the sealed envelope. "Arthur manages his own affairs," I said quietly. "He doesn't need a guardian. He needs space." Julian exhaled sharply. "You're making this harder than it has to be." "No," I replied. "You're just reading the wrong map." I hung up. The storm on the long-range forecast was building. But the real weather was already here. I drove him to Margaret Thorne's office on a Thursday morning. The sky was the color of wet slate. Arthur dressed carefully, pressed flannel, polished boots, the silver pocket watch secured in his vest. In the truck, he didn't speak. He just turned the brass compass over in his palm, aligning it with the dashboard until the needle settled true. I offered to wait in the car. He shook his head. "Sit," he said. 53 minutes. That's all it takes to straighten a crooked line. I watched the lobby clock. 53 minutes to the minute. When the inner door opened, he walked out differently. Not younger, but lighter. The way a man walks when he's finally set down a weight he's been carrying since before you were born. Margaret Thorne walked him out, offered a firm handshake, and met my eyes with a quiet, knowing nod. In the truck, he buckled his seatbelt and stared out at the parking lot. "I fixed something I should have fixed years ago," he said. I asked what. He just tapped the pocket watch. "You'll find out." Same as always, the decline didn't announce itself. It accumulated. He slept longer. The chipped enamel thermos he'd carried for decades started sitting half full on the counter. His hands, usually steady enough to draft a property line freehand, began to tremble slightly when he held a pen. I adjusted his schedule, moved appointments closer, took on fewer restoration contracts to cover the gaps. I didn't call Julian. I didn't call my parents. I just absorbed the weight, because that's what guardians do. They don't announce the carrying. They just carry it. One evening, I found him watching me log his vitals, jaw tight, refusing to acknowledge the fatigue. He reached over and stopped my hand. "You're doing the thing," he said softly. "The thing where you bear it so no one sees the strain." I told him I was fine. He gave me that slow, weathered smile. "So am I," he lied. We sat in the quiet, two men refusing to break in front of each other. Later, as I turned off the lamp, he spoke into the dark. 4 months. You rebuilt your practice. You never once asked what's in it for you." I told him there was nothing to ask. He shook his head. "That's the whole thing, Elias. A cleared check buys a transaction. Showing up without a price tag? That's a kept word." I didn't cry. I just turned the radio down, left the compass on the nightstand, and let him sleep. The storm was coming. And this time I was ready. He didn't wake up on a Wednesday morning. I knew before I opened the bedroom door. The way you know a room has lost its anchor. The silver pocket watch was still ticking on the nightstand. The leather journal lay closed beside it. The chipped enamel thermos sat rinsed and upside down on the drying rack. He'd washed it himself. 82 years old, 4 months from a porch in a thunderstorm, and his last act was ensuring I wouldn't have to. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The brass compass needle rested steady. Then I did what needed doing. I called the physician. I called the funeral home. And because they were blood, and decency doesn't require reciprocity, I called my parents. My mother answered on the second ring. "Mom," I said. "Arthur passed last night." There was a silence. Then, quick and bright, cutting through the quiet, "Oh. Has anyone called the lawyer?" Her father was hours cold, and her first instinct was the estate. I ended the call. I made coffee in his thermos. I let it go cold just to measure the weight of the silence. The funeral was where my parents staged their performance. Charcoal gray. Sunglasses indoors. Tears dispensed on schedule to every cousin who approached. "We took such good care of him," my mother repeated in the receiving line, until the line itself believed it. At the end, he just wanted to be with family. People nodded. They held her hands. Julian gave a eulogy about legacy that sounded suspiciously like a property pitch. My father stood apart, staring at the floor, occasionally glancing at the casket before looking away. The narrative shifted fast. By Monday, the family thread was active. Elias isolated him. Elias turned him against us. Elias is positioning for the estate. I didn't respond. Arguing with a curated story is like trying to preserve a document while someone keeps tearing the edges. You don't win by shouting. You win by keeping the original intact. I let them talk. The reading was in 10 days. And in archival work, the truth doesn't need defense. It just needs to be presented. The conference room smelled of rain and archival paper. 10 days after the funeral, we sat around a polished oak table. My parents, Julian, two distant relatives acting as witnesses, and me. Margaret Thorne sat at the head, a leather folio aligned perfectly before her. Beside it rested a heavy metal lockbox. I felt the brass key in my coat pocket. It wasn't just metal anymore. It was a coordinate. Arthur updated his estate 8 weeks ago, Margaret stated, her voice cutting through the drumming rain against the windows. The room went still. 8 weeks. After the porch. After the storm. After I'd moved him into my apartment and started treating his care like a fragile manuscript. She opened the folio. Before we read the will, we must address the asset structure. Arthur didn't just own a surveying estate. He retained the historic conservation trusts and water rights beneath it. She turned a statement toward us. As of last month, those assets are valued at $18.4 million. Julian made a sharp, involuntary sound. My mother's polished composure fractured. That's impossible. We already received the $900,000. That was his gift to Roy. It's settled. Margaret didn't blink. She slid a single page across the table. It wasn't a gift. It was documented as an advance against Roy's share. Under the terms Arthur signed, the $900,000 is deducted from his portion. What remains? She paused, letting the silence do the work. Is negligible. My mother gripped the table edge. He manipulated a confused old man. This is undue influence. Margaret's tone remained clinical. The file contains capacity assessments from 2 independent physicians. He was fully competent. You're welcome to contest it. Then Margaret turned to me. She picked up the cream envelope I'd found and never opened. Arthur asked that I read this to all of you. She unfolded the letter. His handwriting was blocky, steady. To the ones who got the check, I hope it spends well. I gave it to you on purpose. I wanted to see what a man does when he thinks the money is already his, and the old man is just wait. Now I know. She looked up, then continued. To Elias. You didn't open the envelope. I watched you put it back. You never asked what was in it for you. Not once. Not on the worst night. That is the only reading of a person I have ever trusted. The land was never just dirt, kid. Neither were you. Take care of it like you took care of me. The room erupted. My mother was shouting about lawyers, about theft, about 30 years of sacrifice. Julian had his head in his hands. My father just stared at the carpet, his mouth working but producing no sound. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I stood up, placed the brass compass and the leather journal gently on the table beside the statement, and looked at my mother. I'm not contesting this, I said, my voice steady enough to cut through her noise. I'm not arguing, posting, or calling the cousins. Grandfather already said everything in writing. I'm just going to do what he asked. You had a transaction. I had a man I never sent back. That's the only difference there ever was. I nodded once to Margaret, turned, and walked out into the rain. The ledger was balanced. The promise was kept. My parents kept the $900,000. It was already spent, a luxury sedan, a kitchen renovation, the down payment on Julian's failed project. But the advance meant the books were closed. They didn't contest. The capacity assessments saw to that. The storm had passed, leaving only the quiet aftermath of a ledger finally balanced. I did what Arthur asked. I established the Vance Archival Trust, funding the preservation of historic land records and water rights that families often discard. We stabilize what's fragile. Good records, like good promises, earn their keep by outlasting the people who write them. His brass compass rests on my workbench now, needle pointing true. The leather journal holds my own notes. On heavy mornings, I touch the silver pocket watch by the door. I don't feel triumphant. I feel the quiet grief of winning something I'd trade back in a heartbeat for one more afternoon mapping boundaries with him. A transaction clears in a second. People will tell you that settles the account. But keeping a promise takes the rest of your life. And in the end, that's the only record that matters when the room goes silent. Take care of your people. Not for the payout. For the promise.